Sarah's house seemed to grow smaller each day, the rooms more cramped, the silence thicker. The gestures between her and Michael had transformed into a mechanical dance, filled with predictable movements and a lack of connection. Each embrace felt more like a formality, each kiss more distant, as if they were two strangers sharing the same roof. She watched Michael preparing breakfast, his movements precise and calculated. The white mug was placed exactly in the same spot as always, the toast with the same amount of butter, the newspaper folded beside it with an almost mathematical regularity. Nothing there breathed spontaneity. Everything seemed like a programmed sequence. "Are you traveling today?" Sarah asked, breaking the deafening silence. Michael didn't even raise his eyes from the newspaper. "Yes, meeting in Chicago. I'll be back tomorrow night." How many times had this scene repeated itself? How many mornings had passed with this same script? Sarah felt that something essential had been lost along the way. Something that went beyond words. Something that related to the essence of feeling. The intimacy between them had transformed into an arid landscape, where each gesture seemed more like an obligation than a genuine manifestation of affection. The touches had lost their magic. Their gazes no longer met with the same intensity, and desire seemed to have been locked away in a distant drawer, confined and forgotten. It wasn't a question of not loving each other. It was something more complex, more subtle. It was as if they had lost their sync, the secret code that had once united them so deeply. The years of marriage had accumulated like layers of dust on an antique piece of furniture, obscuring the original shine. Sarah knew she needed to do something. She couldn't continue in that automated existence, where routine consumed any possibility of true connection. It was then that her mind turned to Eleanor, her grandmother, a woman of ancestral wisdom who always welcomed her in moments of greatest emotional turbulence. She decided she needed to leave. A trip to the small town where Eleanor lived, a place far from the big cities, surrounded by mountains and ancient stories. Perhaps there she could find some light, some advice that would help her rekindle the flame that seemed to have gone out in her marriage. Michael didn't even seem surprised when she informed him of her decision to travel. He limited himself to a discreet "have a good trip" while putting away his briefcase. The goodbye kisses were quick, almost protocol, without the slightest intensity. The trip would be a journey not only geographical, but above all internal. Sarah felt that something important was about to happen, a transformation that went beyond her conscious will. The road wound between verdant hills, and each curve seemed to bring with it an invitation to reflection. Her memories danced like shadows through the car window. She remembered times when she and Michael were different, when love was an almost palpable force between them. The first years of marriage had been full of discoveries, of an intimacy that transcended the physical. What happened to change everything? How could two beings who once loved each other with such intensity have reached that state of distance? Questions without immediate answers echoed in her mind as the rural landscape revealed itself before her eyes. Eleanor's town appears like a whisper among the mountains, small houses of stone and wood, flowery gardens, a place that seemed to have stopped in time. There, the rhythms were different, slower, deeper. Sarah knew that in her grandmother she would find not only comfort, but mainly wisdom. Eleanor's house was like an open book of stories. Each object seemed to hold a memory. Each corner breathed ancestral narratives. The walls, covered with old photographs and small objects, told silent stories of love, loss, and overcoming. Eleanor received her with an embrace that seemed to condense decades of love and understanding. Her eyes, even aged, retained a youthful sparkle, a wisdom that overflowed from every glance. The fireplace in the living room was lit, the flames dancing hypnotically, creating shadows that seemed to tell ancient stories. "You've come seeking something, my dear." It wasn't a question, but a statement. Eleanor knew how to read Sarah's, silences as if they were words written in a secret language. Sarah couldn't hold back the tears. They flowed silently, carrying with them all the frustration accumulated over the past few years. "How do you keep the flame of love alive, Grandma?" she asked, her voice choked. Eleanor served 2 cups of herbal tea, a ritual that always marked important moments between them. The warm and comforting aroma hung in the air, mixing with the smell of wood burning in the fireplace. "Let me tell you a story," said the old woman, her eyes gaining a special sparkle. "A story about John and Mary, 2 beings who understood the true meaning of intimacy." And so, lulled by the warmth of the fireplace and the soft sound of Eleanor's voice, Sarah immersed herself in a narrative that promised to transform her understanding of love and connection. Eleanor's voice was like a musical instrument, modulating tones and rhythms that brought the story to life. Sarah was completely engrossed, her eyes fixed on the flames in the fireplace, absorbing every word as if she were diving into a completely new universe. "John and Mary lived in a small town in upstate New York," Eleanor began. "They were different from all the couples you could imagine. It wasn't a love based on overwhelming passion or cinematic romance, but something much deeper and truer. The tea was almost untouched, the herbs leaving a delicate aroma that filled the room. The fireplace crackled, its flames creating dancing shadows on the wooden walls, as if they were silent witnesses to that narrative. John was a dedicated teacher, known for his ability to listen, not just hear, but truly understand what people were saying. His specialty was mathematics, but his real talent lay in his ability to connect with people, to make them feel truly important. Mary worked in a small psychology office in the same town. Her therapeutic approach was different. She believed that each human being carried a unique story, and that understanding that story was more important than any standardized diagnosis or treatment. They met at an education conference, Eleanor continued. It wasn't love at first sight like in those movie stories. It was something more subtle, deeper, an intellectual connection that quickly transformed into emotional complicity. Their first date wasn't marked by grand gestures or passionate declarations. It was a simple conversation about education, about how each human being learns in different ways. John was impressed by Mary's sensitivity in understanding the nuances of learning, and Mary admired John's ability to see beyond numbers. The early years of marriage were built on a solid foundation of mutual respect. They weren't perfect, far from it. They had arguments, moments of disagreement, but always with one essential characteristic: the genuine desire to understand each other. Their intimacy went far beyond the physical. They were able to exchange glances and understand complete thoughts. In moments of silence, they could communicate more than many couples could in long conversations. True intimacy, Mary would say in her lectures, is not about occupying the same space. It's about allowing the other to occupy your inner world with respect and delicacy. John had his own way of showing love. He prepared Mary's breakfast every day, not as an obligation, but as a gesture of affection. He knew every detail. He knew exactly how she liked her toast, the exact amount of butter, the blue ceramic mug that made her smile. Mary, in turn, had a habit of leaving small notes where John least expected them. In his work planner, inside, the book he was reading, in his document folder. They weren't grand declarations, but small reminders of affection and connection. They understood something fundamental about relationships, said Eleanor, making a dramatic pause. That love is not a fixed state, but a constant process of choice. Choosing the other every day, choosing connection, choosing understanding. Sarah felt that this story was profoundly shaking her internal structures. Each of Eleanor's words seemed like a gentle hammer breaking her old conceptions about intimacy and love. The flames in the fireplace seemed to dance in sync with the narrative, as if they too were telling the story of John and Mary. A constant movement, but never chaotic. Harmonious. Like the very essence of love that Eleanor was describing. The silence that followed the story of John and Mary was almost as significant as Eleanor's words. Sarah felt her inner world reorganizing, as if every cell in her body was absorbing a new understanding of relationships. So, intimacy isn't just about sex? Sarah asked, her voice revealing a mixture of surprise and relief. Eleanor smiled, that smile of someone who carries centuries of wisdom in a single gesture. Intimacy, my dear, is a river, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but always moving. The old woman got up and walked to an old wooden box. Her movements, even aged, retained a particular grace. She opened the box and took out a set of old photographs, some yellowed by time. "Look," she said, spreading the images on the table. "Each relationship is unique. There is no universal model. There is understanding." The photographs showed couples at different moments, some embracing, others holding hands, some simply sitting close without any explicit physical contact. Each image seemed to tell a silent story of connection. Sarah observed attentively. She now perceived what she couldn't see before. Intimacy wasn't in grand gestures, but in small details. In the look, in the subtle gesture, in the ability to truly see the other. When did I stop seeing Michael? She thought to herself. The question echoed in her mind like an uncomfortable whisper. Eleanor seemed to read her thoughts. It's not about when you stopped seeing. It's about when you stopped truly communicating. The afternoon light softly entered through the window, creating a welcoming and reflective environment. The shadows of the trees drew complex patterns on the wooden floor, as if they were living metaphors for the complexities of human relationships. "Tell me about your first years together," Eleanor asked. And Sarah began to narrate. She remembered her first encounter with Michael, how he won her over not with grand gestures, but with his ability to listen. Michael was an engineer, methodical in his profession, but surprisingly sensitive in his essence. In the early years, they talked for hours, about dreams, projects, fears. They shared books, discussed ideas, built joint projects. Their home was a space of creation, not just a place of existence. "What changed?" Eleanor asked, not as a question, but as an invitation to reflection. Sarah realized routine had become a cloak that covered their connection. Joint projects were replaced by individual agendas, deep conversations by practical communications about household tasks. "Intimacy needs to be cultivated," said Eleanor, "exactly like a plant. It requires attention, care, nourishment." Her grandmother's words were seeds being planted in Sarah's soul, seeds that promised a profound transformation, not only in her relationship, but in her own understanding of human connection. The next day, Eleanor proposed an exercise to Sarah. "I want you to write a letter to Michael, not an email, not a text message. A handwritten letter, like we used to do in the old days." The initial suggestion seemed strange to Sarah. What words could she write after so many years of distance? How to express feelings that seemed to have crystallized over time? Eleanor brought a special paper with a delicate texture and an old fountain pen. "Write what your heart truly feels, without filters, without fear." Sarah took a deep breath. The first few minutes were of absolute blockage. The words seemed to flee, slip through her fingers like water. But gradually, something began to flow. Initially, her writing was timid, formal. But little by little, it transformed into an intimate dialogue, almost like an outpouring. She wrote about the little things she missed, the shared laughter, the dreams they once built together, the complicity that seemed to have been lost along the way. "Remember when we were planning our first trip?" she wrote. "We spent hours choosing every detail, dreaming together. What happened to those two beings who complemented each other?" The letter became a cathartic process. Sarah realized that it wasn't just about expressing grievances, but about reconnecting with her own vulnerability. Each word was like a layer, peeling off, revealing long-held feelings. Eleanor observed in silence, her gaze one of deep understanding. She knew that this moment wasn't about blaming, but about redefining. Communication, said the old woman, is like a dance. It requires two partners willing to move together, respecting each other's steps. When she finished, Sarah had tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of an emotion that mixed relief and hope. The letter seemed to have released something that had been stuck for years. Eleanor then suggested another exercise. Now I want you to reflect on what Michael needs to hear, not what you want to say. It was an invitation to empathy, to step out of her own internal world and truly put herself in the other's place. Sarah realized that much of their distance was born precisely from the inability to really listen. My husband also has fears, she thought. He also has fragilities that I never showed I wanted to understand. Michael was a man of few words, but Sarah knew that internally he was a complex universe. His profession as an engineer had trained him to solve problems, but feelings couldn't be solved with equations or projects. The letter then took on another format. No longer an outpouring, but an invitation. An invitation for Michael to share his own feelings, his own concerns. I want to hear you, she wrote at one point. Really hear you, without judgments, without expectations. By the end of the day, Sarah felt that something had changed internally. It wasn't a complete transformation, but the first step on a journey of reconnection. Night came wrapped in a comforting silence. The flames in the fireplace danced, as if celebrating that moment of discovery and hope. The time to leave arrived. Sarah felt she was no longer the same woman who had arrived days ago. Eleanor hugged her with that embrace that condensed decades of wisdom, a gesture that seemed to transmit more knowledge than 1,000 words. Take with you not just advice, said the old woman, but the courage to be vulnerable. The return journey was a moment of deep reflection. The rural landscape was transforming, fields giving way to more urban scenes, just as her thoughts were reorganizing. Michael was waiting for her at home, not with that distant posture of always, but with a different expression. Something in his gaze had changed, as if he too was waiting for something new. Sarah handed him the letter. Michael received it with a mix of surprise and expectation. His fingers, usually steady in engineering projects, trembled slightly as they touched the paper. He read in silence, first quickly, then more slowly. Each line seemed to provoke a different internal reaction in him. Sometimes he furrowed his brow, sometimes his face softened. When he finished, he raised his eyes. He didn't say anything immediately. The silence between them was dense, loaded with unspoken meanings. Can we talk? Michael finally said, and they talked. Not like in recent years, where conversations were fragmented and superficial, but they truly talked. About fears, expectations, dreams that had been abandoned along the way. Sarah realized that intimacy wasn't something you conquer, but something you build daily. Each gesture, each word, each look could be a brick in this construction. Michael shared his own concerns. The fear of not being enough, of not meeting expectations. His vulnerabilities, so well guarded for years, were beginning to find space to exist. The night found them close, not necessarily in physical contact, but in a harmony they hadn't experienced in a long time. It was as if a new language between them was being discovered. Eleanor was right. Intimacy was a river, and they had just found a new current.